So before I begin, thank you to our tech team for getting this up and running this morning. The bulb on the projector has gone. And so fortunately another projector and a slight movement of Andrew and a whole bunch of cabling and stuff. But thanks guys for getting this up and running. I always love that bulbs are rated with what's called mean time between failure. And that's how long it is, right? The average, the mean. I always think it's mean when the bulb fails. But anyway, that's a whole other story. On to the sermon. I do wonder how hard it would have been for Bartimaeus to speak up. It would have been easier to stay silent. He's blind, so the belief would have been that he was unclean and he had been cast aside. There's no way that he could be like James and John, asking to sit at the right or left hand of Jesus, being so unclean. And yet he persists, even after the crowd begins to rebuke him. He doesn't know if Jesus is close to him yet or not, and yet he calls out in the hope that Jesus, the Son of David, the one who will usher in a new era, will have mercy on him. I wonder if he even dared to think that Jesus would restore his sight when he first cried out for mercy. Because mercy can come in many forms, right? Bartimaeus was probably a beggar, so he could have found mercy in money. He was probably hungry, so he probably could have found mercy in food. And some commentators believe that he might have been even homeless, so he could have found mercy in the safety and security of being back in the community. For me, it is safety and security that makes community desirable. When we gather together as a community like this, a community of God's faithful people, we're safe to talk about our beliefs. We're secure from what may be seen as attacks from the outside. And I can understand how Bartimaeus would have wanted to be part of that. But the question that comes up is, would we have let him? If it were today, would we bring him into the community? Instead, we might suggest for someone who is blind that they, go and have cataract surgery or a lens replacement or something, right? Some form of treatment. Far too often, when we see people who are outside of a community, we put restrictions on them coming in. And I don't mean that solely in church life, but in life in general. How often do we think of that old adage that God helps those who help themselves, right? We put restrictions on God's mercy. Recently, and I know I rarely delve into politics, but I'm going to today, our premier suggested that the best way to solve homelessness is for people to get a job. Which in some ways is true, right? If they get a job, they can afford a home. It's difficult to get a job when you don't have an address, though, or access to a shower, or potentially a phone number. The crowd tries to restrict Bartimaeus' access to Jesus. It isn't a big leap to see that our society at times restricts access for some of the people who need help. But Bartimaeus doesn't give up, and Jesus calls him forward. Now, it may seem like a small thing But one of the things that surprises me is that Bartimaeus throws off his cloak in response to Jesus' call. I was actually feeling like I should wear a cope and throw it off, right, when it got to that part of the reading. But for Bartimaeus, a cloak would have been his protection from the elements. It could have been a possession that he traded for or maybe purchased with the few things that he had. So not only did he throw off his cloak, he threw off his protection and maybe one of his few possessions. But in some ways, he was also throwing off his past and moving forward eagerly to meet Jesus. I know it might be hard for many of us to think of throwing off our past or throwing off what has protected us or something that has been a part of our life for so long. But I also know that many, many people do that, and regularly. Many who throw off their past actually come through these doors. And while I could say something like the parking lot resurfacing keeps these doors open and the lights on, for me, something like that is how we help people throw off their past from Monday to Friday, meeting every morning, so that they can move forward with their lives. Because isn't that part of why we gather as a community in this space? So that we too can move past our past and into the future. It is that new life, that new beginning that each of us is invited to when we gather each week for communion. Walter Brueggemann, a well-known preacher, once said that when the crowd was telling Jesus to take heart, they were also telling him to have hope. And Brueggemann compares that take heart, have hope to the same thing that we say each week when we're celebrating communion. When we use that line, lift up your hearts. Take heart, have hope. When we get to the altar, that is what we are trying to remind ourselves to do. Have hope. We need to be reminded of that because we believe in a Jesus who journeyed with us. He did so with Bartimaeus by stopping and hearing what it is that Bartimaeus needed in the way of having mercy. We believe that Jesus stops and dwells with us. We believe that Jesus begins to ask questions of us, of how he can provide mercy in our lives. And so as we come here each week, in person and online, we're reminded to have hope, to take heart. For just as I imagine it was hard for Bartimaeus to speak up in the beginning, I know that there are days when it's very hard, almost impossible, to have hope that things will get better. But yet, as a community, our task isn't to hold people back and limit them as the crowd started to do with Bartimaeus. Our task as disciples of Jesus is to encourage, to help the blind receive their sight, to help people find what they are searching for, to help people be rescued from what's keeping them from fully living. The fact that we can be encouraging, as the crowd eventually was, and the fact that we can be like Jesus in helping people see the mercy of our God. For that we give thanks. Amen.